forget that night. It was last year, and I had just turned 25. I had been to a friend's wedding in another state and was returning by train. I reached the station around 5 a.m. It was freezing as the temperature had just hit 4 degrees. All I could think of was getting home fast, so I could sleep for hours after being tired from many nights. I generally avoid traveling home alone in the dark, but it was impossible to wait at the station until sunrise because 1 hour seemed like a very long time, so I decided to get a taxi. The distance from the station to my apartment is roughly 40 kilometers. There were 2 taxis, and I got into one of them without making any eye contact with the driver. I told him where I wanted to go, and we started. The man must have been in his late 50s or early 60s. Silver gray hair, big build. I decided to go with this taxi because I thought I'd be more safe with this fellow since he was elderly. And that was a mistake. Nearly 15 to 20 minutes had passed. I was looking at the road ahead. There were very few cars, and all I could see were trees that were close by and fog covered everywhere else. Suddenly I noticed that this guy had been staring at me from the rearview mirror, and he didn't blink or look away when I looked at him. It had been over 2 minutes, and he was still staring. He had scary, droopy eyes. I was very uncomfortable at this point, so I used my scarf to cover half my face, which was only covering my neck all the while. This didn't stop him, and he suddenly started laughing like a maniac. Then he said a word in some other language, so I asked him to repeat, and my heart was beating very fast. "So many people are dying," he said, and he started laughing again. I was too afraid to ask him any questions. I stood there frozen, regretting why I didn't wait at the station. My hands were shivering because I was trying to send a message to a friend, but my fingers just couldn't type properly. He turned around, now facing me, asked me if I was married. I managed to speak nervously, no, and he said, "You will repent." With these words, he started to speed up. My mind was going crazy now. What the fuck did he mean by that? Why would he say such a thing to me? I tried looking around if it was a good idea to get off that taxi, but it was still very dark and there weren't many cars around. There was maybe 2 or 3 cars that would pass us every 5 to 10 minutes. But by this point, I was pretty convinced that he was taking me to some other place. Maybe he wasn't, but I was still just too terrified to think straight. I was trembling with fear, and I was sure he was going to attack me or do something worse. Suddenly he slowed down, and he seemed to be talking to himself. "People die. You'll die. She'll die," pointing to the empty seat. With those words, he stopped the taxi right there and asked me to get down, saying, "We need fresh air, and the petrol is over." He wasn't drunk, but he had been hallucinating since he kept blabbering, looking at the empty seat, and was laughing for no reason. Arguing with him could make him annoyed, so I decided to do as he said until I got some help, or maybe I could stop him in some other way by agreeing to all his demands. I got out of the taxi, and so did he. Now he was right in front of me, but at a car-length distance, holding a lit torch, pointing it at his neck and repeating, "You will repent." I was almost crying due to fear, but running was impossible because I could have been run over by some car due to the fog, and my mind was not working properly by this point. The thought of calling someone didn't occur to me earlier, and now it was too risky since this maniac was standing right there holding that torch and moving his head like some possessed person. It felt like a scene from a horror movie, and his eyes appeared bigger than normal due to the torchlight that illuminated his creepy and now serious face. He said something again, which I didn't understand. I was sure he was going to kill me or torment me before that. I was extremely restless and looking around everywhere for help. To my relief, there was a car passing by and it stopped there looking at us just standing in the middle of the road. The random passerby came running to me and asked me to go towards his car where his daughter, who was nearly my age, opened the door. The insane cab driver ran back to his taxi and drove off in seconds. I was still breathing heavily and told them what had happened in the last 30 or 40 minutes. They told me I was going in the opposite direction of my destination, and it was not a safe area since many incidences had already occurred with girls in that area. I was right. That driver was taking me to some other place. They had sensed something was wrong by the way that maniac stood there holding the torch and the way the light shone my silhouette more clearly, so they decided to check what was going on. Had they not stopped, I wouldn't be alive to tell this incident. Since that night, I never travel alone again at night. I'm thankful that those people who saved my life stopped. And sometimes we see many people who say they need help, but we fear it could be a trap and we don't stop. Had they thought the same thing, I'd be dead.
Me and my sisters, of which I have 3, grew up in a smallish country town in rural Australia. As you could probably imagine, there was not a lot going on there, and one by one, we jumped ship and moved to greener pastures. In this instance, bigger, more exciting cities. This story is not mine, it is my youngest sister's. When it came time for her to follow suit and move out, she followed the rest of us to Sydney. At the time this story takes place, she was 19 years old. At her first work Christmas party, not long after she'd arrived in town, she got slightly intoxicated and, not knowing the city very well, opted to pay for a taxi in order to get home safely. She left the party, flagged one down, jumped in the front seat next to the driver, advised her destination, and began making polite conversation. As she tells it, the driver was fine at first, but before too long he began turning the conversation to her looks and her job, telling her that she was gorgeous and asking if she did any modeling. She laughed it off and told him no. It was at this point that, while driving the taxi, he reached underneath her seat, pulled out a camera, and started taking her photo. His compliments grew increasingly cruder, and she asked him repeatedly to stop taking her picture before getting angry and yelling at him to stop the taxi and let her out, which he would not do. Thinking quickly, she looked ahead to see if there were any red lights coming up where he would have to stop the car. Luckily, there was one fast approaching. The driver slowed down gradually rather than driving to the light and stopping, all the while continuing to take her photo. When he was finally moving slow enough that she felt she could exit the car without injuring herself, she opened the door and jumped out. He was moving slowly enough at this point that, thankfully, she was not injured. Drunk, scared, and lost, she sat in the gutter briefly to collect herself before finally coming to the realization that, as she had no clue where she was, she would have to get in another taxi in order to get home. Reluctantly, she flagged down another car, this time getting in the back seat and once again advising her destination. The driver of the second car saw that she had been crying and was visibly shaken up, and asked her what had happened and if she was all right. She explained the events. The driver paused for a moment before informing her that the first driver had been taking her in the complete opposite direction of where she had told him she needed to go. Attempts were made to find out who this guy was and report him. However, as my sister was drunk and new to the city, she was not able to provide enough specific information, i.e. location, exact time, taxi company, description of driver, etc. Since this incident, whenever she has no other option but to get a taxi home, the first thing she does after getting in the car is take a photo of the driver's license with her phone. It makes my skin crawl to think that the guy who did this is more than likely still driving taxis in Sydney, and that this is heralded as being the safest way to get home if you're a young woman and it's late at night.
I work at a bar in a suburb of Melbourne that is safe during the day, but has become sort of notorious for a high rate of rapes and abductions during the nighttime, specifically along this main street that my work is on. I often work night shifts or late shifts. Tonight I even finished at 11. For some context, I am a petite 19-year-old girl. I got out of work at 11 and started to walk down the street, which is quite well lit in some parts, but quite dark in others, and began looking to hail a taxi. I was having no luck finding one, and in fact there were very few cars about, which was unusual. I looked across the road and saw a dude with a hoodie on that was concealing most of his face. He looked young, maybe early to mid-20s, and high on something. He seemed quite shady to me, and I noted he was pretty tall but thin, and I guess I looked at him for too long, because then he crossed the street towards me. I stopped looking at him and started walking sort of fast down the street, looking behind me to keep my eye on his distance and to now more desperately get in a taxi. I turned around to look at him, and to my relief he was walking into a side street. I stepped onto the street trying to get a better view down the road when he came back around from the side street. My stomach dropped as I saw he was now with two more guys. I started to walk really fast now, and they began to walk after me. I was walking as fast as I could without jogging. I was getting really panicked and was thinking of hailing down any car to ask someone for help. The three men were getting closer, and they were shouting at me, but my anxiety sunk in and I didn't hear what they said. It was only white noise. A taxi with its lights off drove past, and I ran out into the middle of the road. The driver said he was finished for the day and wasn't taking any more customers. I told him I was being followed and asked if I could sit in his car for a second to feel safe. He let me in the taxi and drove 20 meters away and told me to get out. The men were all still there. I begged him to take me out of sight a little further down the road. He noticed how scared I was then and had got concerned and fatherly. The taxi driver was extremely lovely and refused to let me get out of his car until he found me another taxi to take me home. He drove around with me for a few minutes until we found one. He beeped the other cab down and explained the situation to him. I thanked him profusely and we swapped cars. The next driver was also incredibly nice. He said he had a young daughter and got quite upset and angry thinking about how people can take away your right to feel safe. I had felt like I was in real danger, and I'm so thankful they were there and it helped me out.
This incident happened not all that long ago. I'm a 19-year-old female and obviously enjoy the night out with my friends. This particular night, a girlfriend and I had headed down to our local club/pub. We were dancing, drinking, and having a great time when I noticed it was about 2 a.m. coming up to the closing time, around 3 a.m., and we should probably think about heading off soon, as if we waited until it had closed, the wait for a taxi would be quite long as everyone is looking for one. So I let my friend know my plans, and she insists she wanted to stay, and she then walked me out the front while I waited for a taxi. As we get to the top of the stairs, she sees me off at the door and goes back inside. I say goodbye to the bouncers, as I said it's our local, and start walking over to the next taxi in the line. As I start approaching the taxi, I hear my friend call me from behind. She still has my bank cards and money, luckily. I walk back to the door to get them off her and then say goodbye again. This time, as I turn to leave, the bouncer says to me, "You may want to take the second taxi in the line." Upon me questioning him, he doesn't seem to have a reason behind his advice and just insists I trust him. I'm from Australia, and taxis usually wait in lines, and you have to take the next taxi in line as part of fairness. I explained to the bouncer not only will taxi driver number 1 not be happy, but taxi number 2 may not take my fare for no valid reason. Annoying, I know. Me, being 19 and naive, think to myself, I only live around the corner, I have my phone, what's the worst that could happen, right? Wrong. I took the first taxi in line, and there were no immediate alarm bells. He didn't seem different than any other taxi driver, not exactly polite nor rude, just a taxi driver. We are a few minutes into the fare, driving along the coastlines to my suburb when, all of a sudden, he pulls the taxi over to the side of the road and starts walking around to my door. At this point, I'm so confused as to what is going on. First thought maybe there's a flat tire, until he opens my door. I asked him what he's doing, and he replies, "We're going to the beach." Alarm bells and red flags went off left, right, and center. I grabbed my phone and dialed 000 right away and told him I was calling the police. He started to panic and told me not to be silly, and he just wanted some quality time. He reached for my arm to try and get me out of the car. I pushed him away, closed the door, and waited to be connected. I read a lot about people who are polite to creepers in these situations, but I was anything but. At this point, I was connected with someone from emergency who asked what my emergency was, and I said I needed assistance and gave her my address. She then proceeded to tell me I needed to call the police assistance line if it wasn't an emergency. I responded with, "Well, it's about to be if you don't get someone down here." She assured a car was on the way and to get out of the car. We were only a minute or two down the road from where we departed, and usually there are 3 or 4 squad cars there preparing for the end of the night antics. I knew I would have assistance in no time. While all this was happening, he was walking back to his driver's side and attempting to get back in. I don't know if he would have driven away with me in the car, kicked me out, or what, but I got out and he sped off. I kicked myself for not getting his taxi ID, which is something I usually do. I kicked myself even more for not listening to the bouncer who, I see now, obviously had a good reason for me to not get in this car. I rang my friend and asked her to stay on the phone with me. I just told her I was still outside waiting for the taxi and got bored. She offered to come and wait, but I insisted I was fine. Once the police came, they took me home and asked what had happened. They took a statement from me, but there wasn't much they could do as I didn't get a license plate or taxi ID. The most I could provide was his appearance and taxi company. I didn't tell anyone about this situation except for my then friend, now boyfriend, who was a little shaken up by this. I hate thinking about what could have happened that night, and how lucky I am that it didn't. About 2 months on, my boyfriend, his housemate, and my sister arranged a cab to pick us up from my boyfriend's place and take us to the same venue this all happened at. And who was the driver? Yep, same guy. I didn't say anything at the time to anyone because I knew that wouldn't have turned out well, but this time I got his ID and plate number and reported it to the police the next day. Apparently, this wasn't the first complaint they've had against this particular driver, but it was the furthest he had gone. Most of the other complaints were creepy remarks, etc. From what I know, the police made contact with the taxi company and informed them of the situation, and I don't know the outcome from then. I have definitely learned my lesson from this.
I'm a 17-year-old female from the UK, and this took place a few months ago at my grandfather's funeral, or at least the after-party to it. Me, my cousin, and her best friend were drinking, because that's what you do at a wake or whatever. I was 16 at the time, and I needed to go home at 1 in the morning, and I was completely shit-faced, so I called a taxi. I wasn't ready to walk home in the state that I was in. After 10 minutes, the taxi arrived. I quickly finished my drink, said goodbye to everyone there, and got in the taxi waiting outside. The taxi driver was a pretty ordinary-looking Pakistani or Indian guy with dark hair and glasses. I paid to go home, which cost something along the lines of £40.50. And I never said a word to him besides my destination. On the way, he asked a bunch of questions, like my age, why I was out drinking so late, and why I'm going home alone. I told him I was 18. I don't know why I did, and maybe I wanted to feel older or something. I said that I was back from a funeral and wanted to dull the pain. I didn't answer the last question. He asked me if anyone was at home to open the door for me or to see me to bed safely, me thinking this dude was just a good Samaritan wanting to know I was safe. I just said that everyone at home was likely asleep, but it didn't really matter because I was often a rebel and came in late and they knew that. In retrospect, I probably should have just said there was someone at home waiting for me to return. Around halfway through the journey home, the driver drove past a turn he was meant to be taking. I told him, and he just said this way was much quicker, and he didn't want to waste my time. Wrong turn after wrong turn, and he used the same excuse every time. This way is much quicker, and don't worry about it. He went down an alley near a closed-down theater and a car dealership, which was also shut down. I told him he must be confused because this is not near my house. The car stopped slowly, and I became confused. I asked what was wrong, and he put his arm around me. He told me that he couldn't focus on the road because of how distracting I was. He then leaned into a kiss, but I blocked him off with my hand and asked what he was doing. Maybe I gave him some mixed signals, I don't know. Keeping one hand on my shoulder, he grabbed my leg. This is when I started getting serious creeper vibes. He then unzipped his trousers and presented himself to me. I went from thinking he was just a regular guy who's been receiving mixed signals to a full-blown rapist in seconds. He began to feel me up, my chest and thighs. I honestly had no idea what to do at this point. Should I do what he wants, or should I try to escape? But if I don't, he'll probably kill me. I made a snap judgment and went along with it. I pretended it was totally fine, and what he was doing wasn't rape, and that I wasn't underage. I started to feel him up too, and I kissed him a few times. And luckily, before it could get anywhere else, he got a call. He told me that he needed to answer it and that we had to do this some other time. I said okay, and he dropped me off at home. I haven't told anyone and don't plan on doing so, and haven't called a single taxi since. I'm just glad it didn't go anywhere, because if it did, I could have been raped or killed. Whoever was on the other side of that phone call, I owe you my life. I called the police anonymously the next morning and gave them a description. No arrest has been made yet.
My husband and I were stopping over in New York before heading to our temporary home of Poland. We had been living there for about a year and are originally from Australia. We'd spent the past year traveling throughout some of the more shady parts of Europe, so we thought we were generally prepared for any weird incidents. We were tired as we walked through JFK, ignoring everyone who wanted us to take their special taxi. We went outside and waited in the line with all the other irritated travelers. When it was our turn, the taxi driver got out and left. Another guy came and took our bags. The motor was still running. I didn't really think anything of it and didn't really care at that point. However, I insisted I take my own bag and tried to open the trunk. "No!" He snapped at me. I was startled and said it was okay, I'll just sit with it on my lap. My husband and I traveled light, so we only had one suitcase between us. "Can you open the trunk?" my husband asked the guy. "Otherwise, there's no room for us." The guy already looked pissed, and all we were asking him to do was his job. I was already looking around for another cab because I couldn't be bothered. "Fine," the guy snapped and basically ripped the trunk open. I hadn't gotten into the car yet. It was kind of a paranoid thing that I never get into a taxi alone as a result of some kidnapping stories in Greece of a similar nature, so I waited. And I saw what was in the trunk. It wasn't all over the flooring, just on one side. I instantly felt ill. It looked a lot like blood. The spot was wet and I stared blankly. With the dim light, I could just make out various other stains of similar but darker colors. I had barely begun to process it all before the suitcase was in and the trunk door was slammed. I was now wide awake and did not want to get in that taxi. Everything was wrong and this was a mistake. "What's the holdup? Get in!" The taxi stand dude yelled at us, as equally pissed off passengers behind were eagerly awaiting their ride. I tried to get my husband's attention, but he was already in the back seat. If this were a horror movie and I was watching, I'd be screaming at myself, "Don't get in the cab!" So I got in the taxi with my bag on my lap. I clutched it as we spun around corners, went forward sharply, and had brakes slamming. I felt sick and couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. Was it real? Halfway through my haze, I realized this was not the way. I mean, far be it for me to tell taxi drivers in their own city where the hell they're going, but I like to be prepared and I like to know where I am. And we were not taking the tourist scenic route where they charge you a lot of dough. This guy was just going the wrong way. "You're going the wrong way." The words fell out of my mouth. The guy said nothing. He didn't flinch, didn't move. "What?" my husband asked me. "We are going the wrong way," I shouted. "Are we going the wrong way?" my husband asked. "We are going the wrong way!" I shouted again. My husband, not one to take shit from anyone, said, "Hey, man, don't think you can screw with us. We're not paying you more than we agreed upon, so stop fucking around and take us where we're going or we're going to call the cops." He had no idea why I was freaking out. I didn't care about the money. I just thought we were a pawn in this guy's master plan. We were going to swim with the fishes in the Hudson or something because I was going crazy and my mind was wandering. There was blood in the trunk. This guy's going to kill us with his driving, although he had nothing on Romanian taxi drivers, And maybe planning on it for later or in some warehouse with all of its serial killer cab driver friends. The driver immediately slammed on the brakes at a set of lights. I'm pretty sure this taxi we're in is not a taxi, I muttered to myself. But then the cab driver spoke up. Do you see this sign? This is a motherfucking taxi, he snapped. Then do your motherfucking job, my husband snapped at him without a second thought. Perhaps the guy thought this was too much trouble, one loudmouth Aussie bogan and his crazy wife, because now we turned around and we were going the right way. We get to the hotel and I made sure to check the trunk again, but it was darker now and I couldn't see anything clearly. Except for lots of shredded rags with a deep rust color, staining them all.